It's my pleasure today to welcome our speaker, Dr. Divyangana Rakesh. Dr. Rakesh is a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard University who studies the effects of socioeconomic status on child development. She has a PhD from the University of Melbourne and will be talking to us today about some of her doctoral research, which focused on early adverse experiences and brain development and mental health during adolescence. So whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm just going to make sure that everything is working. Does everything look all right? And can you hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, amazing. And can you see the laser pointer as well when I use it?
I can, yeah.
Okay, great.
Great. So just for the audience, there'll be a chance for questions at the end, but if anything comes up as we're going along, please feel free to post it in the chat and I can ask the speaker at the end.
Yeah, if something is actually hindering understanding, please feel free to interrupt me. So that would be completely fine. Okay, so let's get started. So I did my PhD at the University of Melbourne, as you were just told, and it was on early adversity brain development and mental health during adolescence. But today I will primarily be talking about socioeconomic status or SES. But if anyone wants to talk about anything else that I'll briefly mention, I'll be happy to talk about that afterwards. Okay, so before getting into the science, I thought I would just tell you a little bit about me and my nonlinear trajectory in the academia. So I did an undergrad from the University of Delhi in biochemistry a long time ago. And at the time, I wasn't super sure about whether or not I wanted to do biochemistry. And this, really great opportunity came up and I took it, which was to do an MBA in marketing from an institute in Ahmedabad in India. After which I went on to work in marketing at L'Oreal at their Indian headquarters for about 3 years, which was in Mumbai. And I was really not happy. So obviously the pay was great and I was happy on the day of the paycheck. But other than that, it wasn't very satisfying. So I really missed science. So I wanted to make my way back. And I was lucky enough for this other opportunity to come up. And I did my master's in research in neuroscience from the University of Bordeaux in France, where I spent 2 years and I did a lot of wet lab, mice, working with single cells and synapses and things like that. And I just, was doing development, but I wanted to do human development. So then I moved to Melbourne in Australia, where I did my PhD. And that's basically the work that I'll be talking to you about today. I worked with Professor Sarah Whittle. And since July this year, I've been working as a postdoctoral scholar at Harvard University. Okay, so now getting on to the actual content, which is what everyone is here for. The early environment plays a really important role in shaping child developmental outcomes during childhood, adolescence, and beyond. So it's not just during, while it's happening or just after. The early environment actually plays a role in very long-term outcomes. Now, there are many different aspects of a child's environment that can have an impact on outcomes. So from abuse and parenting styles, subtle variations in parenting styles, to peer relationships and bullying, victimization, socioeconomic status, the kind of school a child goes to, the kind of neighborhood they live in, all of this can have a really big impact. So for example, negative and or adverse environmental experiences like abuse or exposure to violence could contribute to negative mental health. On the other hand, parental neglect and lack of cognitive stimulation in the home could lead to lower cognitive performance and academic achievement. So, you have these kind of subtle associations between normative variations in different things and outcomes. But I was most interested in SES or socioeconomic status, primarily because of my upbringing. So I was brought up in India, where you see a lot of poverty and you see that intergenerational transmission of poverty and all of its consequences on well-being and academic achievement, and just career trajectories, all that kind of stuff. And this really motivated me to want to study the role that SES plays in child development, because these differences in SES don't just appear when you're older. It's not that, you don't get a good job. It starts really early on in primary school. So I really wanted to study this effect. But in addition to that, the other thing that motivated me was, are there things that these children already have that we can leverage, or is there anything we can provide them with that that actually buffers or protects them from the negative effects of SES. So the role of moderating factors, basically, which is how I will structure this presentation. So as I talk through it, I'll first talk about the role that SES plays in outcomes, and then I'll talk about the role of moderating factors. As I mentioned earlier, I also examined the role of childhood maltreatment in child development in my thesis. And that work was longitudinal, and that work actually focused more on mental health than my work on SES. But I will not be presenting on that today, but I'm happy to answer any questions or chat about it afterwards if anyone wants. Okay. So early low socioeconomic status substantially increases risk for mental health problems and has profound implications for academic and other outcomes. But what we don't really understand is what is the underlying mechanism of this association? So how is it that SES is getting under the skin? And what is it that is transmitting the effects of low SES and resulting or contributing to these worse academic and other outcomes, right? Now, brain development has been suggested to be a potential mechanism as the brain is undergoing dynamic development during childhood and adolescence. So right from birth all the way into your 20s, the brain is going through different developmental phases, all the way into your late 20s, actually. And while it's undergoing these dynamic changes, which happen particularly very early on in the first few years, and then again during puberty, and then there are plateaus in between, it is very susceptible to the person's environment. So therefore, the early environment, including SES, could play a role in like shaping brain development, which then contributes to mental health and cognitive function, right? So brain development was basically the main thing that we examined in my thesis. But before I get into any of the actual studies, I thought I would give a little bit of information on what in the brain did we actually measure and explain a few concepts. So first, the kind of brain development we measured was brain structure and function connectivity. And this was measured using MRI or magnetic resonance imaging. So in this case, the ones that in the data that we used, we basically just asked children to do nothing. They're lying in the scanner passively. They go in, they're in there for about 30 or 40 minutes, and we do different kinds of scans. They've got their eyes closed. So there's no task or anything involved, and we measure brain structure. So now, what is brain structure and how do we measure it? So essentially, we looked at things like thickness, surface area, and volume of different regions of the brain. So once the person has gone into the scanner and then come out, we get loads of images of their brain, which we then put into processing software. And that software is able to kind of parcellate or divide the brain up into different regions, which you can see here, like the different colors reflect different regions of the brain. And it's also able to measure how thick each part of the brain is, the processing software, as well as what is the surface area. And thickness essentially reflects the gray matter thickness. So from where the brain starts to where the white matter starts, how thick is it? And then, of course, how much area does it cover, right? And the second thing is functional connectivity. Now, this one will require a little bit more explanation, but what is functional connectivity addressed? Again, like I said, we ask people to do nothing. They're just lying in the scanner with their eyes closed. If they're really young, in fact, toddlers, we expect them to be asleep. And we measure the brain activity of all of these different regions in the brain while they're doing nothing. So even when subjects are thinking of nothing in particular and lying passively, the brain has what is called intrinsic activity. So even while you're doing absolutely nothing. And regions of the brain that otherwise act in conjunction to perform tasks also tend to activate together during rest. So what does that actually mean? So if you have two different parts of the brain that are both important for language, they will obviously activate together while you're reading a book, right? But even when you're not reading a book and you're doing nothing, that kind of co-activation pattern is ingrained in those regions. So then they tend to like activate and deactivate together, even when you're not using them actively. So these regions are suggested to be functionally connected. And functionally connected regions are regions that show similar or correlated brain activity. And I'll illustrate this in a second. So you can see in this figure here, you've got three regions, A, B, and C, right? And this little thing here basically reflects the activity across time. So if a person is lying in the scanner for 30 minutes, think about this as the activity for 30 minutes. And Pearson correlation is just a simple correlation coefficient of the activity of these different time series between two regions, right? So to give you what this actually means, you can see that region A and region B show very similar functional connectivity patterns. And that means that they have high functional connectivity. Whereas region B and region C, they don't seem to be correlated at all. It's not like when this is going up or down. It's just they're not correlated. So they have low functional connectivity. Low functional connectivity doesn't mean that, when one goes up, the other goes down. It means that they're just not related to each other. So now on to the studies. In the first couple of studies, we looked at the role that neighborhood disadvantage plays in brain structure and connectivity. So the two things that I've described so far. And the reason that we looked at neighborhood disadvantage is because SES is a very complicated construct, as you're all probably aware. And each of the different ways in which it can be measured reflects slightly different things. And I'll get into this more later. But there's been less of a focus on the neighborhood context, even though so many different aspects of the neighborhood can have a profound effect on child developmental outcomes. Things like, do you have access to green spaces? Then what is, like, how walkable is the place? How much pollution is there? Simple things like that. So I will be talking about this study and following studies in the same way, describe SES brain, and then go on to the buffering associations. So in study 1, we looked at brain structure. So it's neighborhood disadvantage associated with brain structure. And we operationalized brain structure with something called brain predicted age. And I'll just explain that a little bit. But we looked at the trajectory of brain structure over time. So this study was longitudinal, and we had imaging from people at 3 different time points. So we could see how is it changing. So now to calculate brain predicted age, you need something called you need a normative brain age model. Sorry, one second. You need a normative brain age model. So to get a normative brain age model, what we did was we took structural MRI data. So again, thickness, surface area, volume of these different brain regions from this large openly available data set of 1,300 people aged 8 to 21 years. And then we put them in this machine learning model along with the person's age. So this allows the machine learning model to learn, okay, what does the thickness of this brain region for this particular aged individual typically look like? Because the sample size was 1,300. So it's like, okay, for a 13-year-old, I expect to see this thickness and this surface area and this volume. And it has the opportunity to learn that. And once it's learned that, we feed it our own data. Right? But we don't give it the age. We're like, here's the thickness, cortical surface area, and all of that for these brain regions for this individual. How old do you think this person is? And we did this with 166 adolescents aged 12 to 20 years at 3 time points. Like I was saying, we had longitudinal data. And what's cool about this is that it spits out a predicted age for each person. So we take the actual age of the individual and we subtract it from the predicted age to get the brain age gap. And it's quite intuitive that if it's a positive value, that means the model thought this person got a brain that is typically older than what is typical for their age, right? But if this predicted age was lower than the actual age of the person, it means that the model thought this person has a younger brain, right? So this essentially allows us to test something like, is SES leading to like faster development or slower development in these people? So we looked at the association between neighborhood disadvantage and brain age gap, which is that, positive and negative reflecting older and younger brains. And we saw that disadvantage was associated with a negative brain age gap trajectory over time. So just to orient you to the figure here, you have age on the x-axis, brain age gap on the y-axis, and these 3 lines reflect levels of disadvantage, right? So this line here is the highest disadvantaged individuals. So you can see they start off with sort of positive values, right? But with a decreasing trajectory, and there's a stabilization over time by the time they reach late adolescence. Now, this essentially reflects actually slower change over time. They have kind of like an initial acceleration followed by a delay in development. That's kind of what this data is telling us. And in the second part of the study, we asked, does temperament or positive parenting moderate these associations between neighborhood disadvantage and brain age gap trajectory? So this was really the most interesting part of the question for us. And we found that high effortful control mitigates the effect of high disadvantage on brain age gap trajectory. So you can see here, first of all, in the low neighborhood disadvantage group, brain age gap is stable, right? Mostly stable. But in the high neighborhood disadvantage group, where there was previously a negative trajectory, in individuals who have high effortful control, that trajectory is less negative. So they have less slow change over time if they've got high effortful control, which is really reassuring because it means that, there are things about an individual's temperament that can protect them. And then similarly, there was a trend towards the moderating role of positive parenting as well. Again, you have stable brain age across time here in people who were not disadvantaged. But here, where there was a negative trajectory, people who experienced positive parenting, so this red line, have almost stable brain age, like it behaves exactly the way that the low neighborhood disadvantage group behaves, which is, again, very, very reassuring. In study 2, we asked, is neighborhood disadvantage associated with resting state functional connectivity, which is what the concept of functional connectivity addressed that I explained to you, between different networks. Now, there's a little bit of a difference between this and the functional connectivity that I explained, because what I explained was that it was connectivity between regions. But what we're looking at is connectivity between groups of regions now, because we basically group regions that carry out similar functions in the brain. So basically all the language ones will be called the language network. And then everything that kind of does executive function or something will be called the executive function network. And then we look at the connectivity between these things. So like groups of regions. So we see how correlated the activity of one group of regions is to another. And for this, we had access to this amazing data set from the United States called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, or the ABCD study. It's the largest data set anyone's ever collected, of around 11,800 kids aged 9 to 10 years. And we were able to use data from 7,600 of them because of, imaging quality and who had data available and things like that. And we use this measure of area deprivation index for neighborhood disadvantage. So what we found was actually all surprising, but also not at the same time, which is that there are widespread effects of neighborhood disadvantage on function connectivity. So now each square in this figure reflects the connectivity between two networks. I've only visualized the ones that were significantly associated with neighborhood disadvantage. So positive values in this figure basically reflect that neighborhood disadvantage was associated with higher connectivity, and cooler colors, or blue, reflect that neighborhood disadvantage was associated with lower connectivity, right? But you can see disadvantage was primarily associated with lower functional connectivity in the brain between networks overall, because it's primarily cooler colors. And these were networks that were involved and have regions that are involved in a host of different functions, like goal setting, planning, self-reflection, but also, interestingly, sensory, motor, and language functioning. Now, this is interesting because traditionally, over the last decade, there's been quite a bit of research on SES, but they tend to focus on prefrontal regions a lot, and also just a little bit of language, because of the profound role that SES plays in shaping cognitive outcomes in young people and academic achievement and things like that. But the research that we've done in my thesis has shown that sensory motor regions are also highly implicated and very important. And this is something that we saw in the systematic review, but then also the two more studies that I'll be presenting to you after this. And it just has implications for how we should proceed with looking at the role that SES plays, because it's obviously not just like prefrontal. Then 50% of these regions, of these connections, that I just presented to you earlier, were associated with worse cognition and mental health. Now, this figure is a little bit challenging to understand, but what I want you to see is that basically positive values here are positively correlated with this. So higher values of cognition and lower values of mental health problems. So basically high connectivity on average in general predicted better cognition and better mental health. But as I showed you in the first figure, disadvantage was associated with lower connectivity. So this essentially means that these changes in connectivity as a function of disadvantage may actually be transmitting the effects that we see on mental health and cognitive function. In the second part of the study, we asked, do positive home and school environments moderate these associations between neighborhood disadvantage and functional connectivity? And some of these brain alterations were actually less pronounced. So it's not all bleak, which was again quite reassuring. So good parenting and school environments can reduce the association between neighborhood disadvantage and functional connectivity. So I'm going to just illustrate the effect here with one thing. So more positive parenting buffers the association. This association was previously negative in individuals who have high disadvantage. They have low connectivity, right? The trend is negative. But at high levels of parental acceptance, that trend is less negative. So that essentially reflects that, more positive parenting is buffering it. And there were similar effects for the school environment as well. So how do we measure the school environment? In large data sets like this, there's not a lot of questions that we can ask people because of the participant burden, but there were 5 or 6 items that they were able to ask the kids. So one was telling the child and their parents that the child did a good job, right? Good relationships with teachers, some say in decision-making regarding rules and class activities, availability of extracurricular activities at the school, and then feeling safe at school. So these 5 or 6 different things kind of encompassed a good school environment. And good parenting involved smiling at the child, expressing their love for the child, supporting the child, and making them feel better when they're upset. So providing warmth and support and discussing the child's worries with them. So these sort of ideas basically is that a good school environment. It's not the only thing that makes a good school environment a good parenting, obviously, but this is how it was measured. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Now, for the subsequent studies, we kind of wanted to look at the different effects of socioeconomic status indicators. Excuse me, just. So as I hinted at earlier, SES is complex and can be measured in a bunch of ways. So one of which is income, education, neighborhood disadvantage. These might be some of the most common. And then there's occupational status as well. But these indices are only moderately correlated with each other. So high income isn't like always predicting high education or vice versa. It's really interesting that they only have a correlation coefficient of 0.4 in big data sets. So this probably reflects that they're associated with different things. So for example, for a child, income could be associated with the quality of healthcare and education that the child has access to. So can your parents afford to send you to private school, for example? And that drastically changes things. The availability of toys and books in the home. And these are important sources of kind of stimulation that children can use to learn. The quality of childcare that parents are able to afford. And then finally, parental stress, because financial strain can put a lot of strain, can cause a lot of stress in the home that can result in parent mental health issues. And then that has an effect on parenting styles. Education, on the other hand, can have an impact through cognitive stimulation. So the activity of, for example, reading before bed is more common in parents that are more educated, regardless of income. Or in, helping children with their homework, again, regardless of income. That's something that happens in educated households. Then semantic and linguistic input and complexity. And finally, parental monitoring and supervision. And neighborhood disadvantage, on the other hand, can lead to exposure to noise, crime, peer influences, pollution, and toxicants. And I just thought I would give you an example at the end of this that kind of demonstrates that they can have very different effects. So for example, in Australia, you can have a really high income household for people that are involved in trades and skilled labor, like for example, roofing and flooring. So you have really high income households that make hundreds of thousands of dollars. But those households are not typically highly educated. So you would see a lot of this, but you wouldn't see some of this. On the other hand, and I can vouch for this, postdoctoral scholars, which in the United States don't make all that much money, but are usually typically educated, right? So you would see a lot of this, but then you wouldn't have this. So I'm just trying to show you that, they can have very different effects on children, which is why they have could have unique associations with brain structure and connectivity. So in studies 3 and 4, we kind of examined the independent associations of these 3 different SES indicators on brain structure and with brain structure and connectivity. We used the same data set, but we had access to more people because of some imaging quality control. Again, age 9 to 10 years. We used the area deprivation index, educational attainment in years, and then income to needs ratio. And they were included in the model simultaneously to see which of these is actually most predictive of connectivity or structure. So the figure is quite busy, but what I want you to basically get out of it is just that SES measures had both common and distinct effects, right? So this is exactly what we hypothesized. They're overlapping constructs, but they also have distinct associations with different connections in the brain. But what was more important is that, again, there was sensory motor and cognitive networks both implicated. So it wasn't just cognitive, but you have a lot of like visual and other motor kind of things that control your hand and leg movements and so on. Those kind of regions were also implicated. For structure, we found that all three SES measures were associated with like the total volume of the brain, the total surface area, and average cortical thickness. So even when included in the model simultaneously, they all account for the variance in those things. But it was primarily neighborhood disadvantage, which was associated with cortical thickness, not the other two variables. But this is a bit of a nuanced thing because it all depended on this one covariate that we had added. So if you like remove total volume of the brain as a covariate, all three SES measures were associated with surface area. But again, you can see that you hear this part of the brain that's visual, this part of the brain that's sensory motor and frontal. So even when regions were involved, in the context of neighborhood disadvantage or others, it was also sensory motor as well as frontal regions. And in this study, the second question we asked was, does high SES in one domain buffer associations between low SES in another and brain structure and connectivity? So this is kind of what I was trying to get at earlier. So even if you don't have a high income, right, if you are educated or if you spend time on these like things that, some of these things that education may be associated with, can that buffer the negative effects that maybe low income has placed? And we see that indeed is the case, which was great to see. So for example, if you live in a disadvantaged neighborhood, but are from a high income household, the relationship with connectivity was lower, was like non-existent, right? So basically higher income mitigated the association. On the other hand, higher income also mitigated the association between educational attainment and cortical thickness and neighborhood disadvantage and cortical thickness. So you can see in this orange line, the association is practically non-existent, right? Like it's way flatter. So income seems to be something that can buffer the effects of low SES in the other domains. So in summary, cumulatively, we've shown that SES is associated with deviations from typical developmental trajectories, and as well as cross-sectional alterations in structure and connectivity. But we've also shown the role of positive psychological and environmental factors in mitigating these effects. So just some closing thoughts. One is that there's widespread effects across studies, and even a systematic review that we did that I didn't present on today. You see that sensory motor as well as higher order cognitive systems are being implicated. Now, this is really interesting and important, I think, for future research because we need to kind of shift focus from a frontocentric approach to try and understand what's actually happening in these less complicated brain systems that is leading to this. And there's also, ideas and hypotheses about kind of the sensory inputs that you receive really early in infancy help shape prefrontal development, actually, by scaffolding all these inputs and kind of teaching your brain how to wire. The second thing that I wanted to bring up is that there tends to be a utilization of a deficit approach in a lot of this research, which I think is something that we need to think a lot about. So when we talk about SES, brain, behavior, including myself, there's a tendency to talk about the deficits that low SES causes, right? Like poor mental health or less cognitive function. But we tried to get away from that a little bit by looking at protective factors and trying to understand the moderating role of different things that children already have or can be provided with. But there's a lot of individual variability in low SES kids, like kids from low SES backgrounds. There's many of them that have really high academic achievement, They have lots of, they don't even have the same brain alterations. And I think that we need to move in a direction where we try to understand a little bit better, like what is causing this individual variability. Obviously, some of it is these protective factors that we've investigated, but there must be many other things. And then finally, there are so many environmental buffering factors, as well as risk, as well as buffering factors. Like obviously we looked at SES, temperament, parenting, school, but there's so many different things that could lead to that individual variability that I mentioned. For example, you could have a really nice neighbor. If your parents work, 2 jobs, they could take care of you, or an older sibling who's great at taking care of you, or a school teacher with whom you have a really great relationship. Like it could be, there's so many different things. And I just wanted to make sure that I conveyed the nuance and complexity of these relationships to not oversimplify what we're talking about. And I thought I would just end with what I think is what is next for me in this area of research. So the first one is that I really want to dig in deeper into more proximal mechanisms. SES is obviously such a broad construct. And what specifically is kind of mediating or moderating these effects, like, for example, is it parental stress from income, or is it parent mental health? Is it something else that basically try to identify those modifiable factors that we can in the future act on to reduce the effects of SES on development? But then also the role of timing of exposure in brain plasticity. So obviously the brain, like I was saying, goes through different phases of development. It's not just like linearly developing throughout all the way to the 20s. There are periods of brain development that are most susceptible to the environment and other things. So kind of try to get at, like, is SES in the first 2 years really important? Is it later? Is it, around puberty? Like, what's happening? And then finally, kind of mapping SES-associated neurodevelopment trajectories from infancy and examining really early outcomes. Because the thing is, we can actually see differences as early as 14 months. And in primary school, by the age, at least in Australia, I'm not aware of other countries, by the age of 9 in standardized testing, children from low SES backgrounds are already 1.5 years behind. And that's at age only 3 years into school. So this gap starts really early and keeps widening. So I really want to start looking at that infancy and toddlerhood period to see what's happening in the brain at that time. And just want to end by thanking my fantastic PhD supervisor, Sarah Whittle, who was just amazing. Andrew was also my supervisor. He was really great to work with. All my co-authors on the project. This is my lab, who's really great. And this is the student body. We had a really nice kind of cohort. And then, of course, the participants of the different studies that I use data from. So the Philadelphia neurodevelopmental cohort, the Origin Adolescent Development Study, and Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. Just big thanks to them for their time. And a few other people who were really important during the PhD, because without learning how to program and learning stats and having incredible mentors, I think this wouldn't have been possible. So thank you.
And thank you. That was really interesting information you presented there. And I think you did a really good job of making some quite complex methods really clear to us. So thank you for that. And all of your research is like pretty relevant to some work that myself and Ilwaz are doing. And I can see, I wasn't sure if that was a hand or a clap there from Ilwaz. So we have some questions in the chat. So from Irene, she asks, in the neighborhood disadvantage work, was individual level disadvantage controlled for? So I think this is from the first studies that you were presenting.
So from the first study that we did do some analyses where we controlled for, I think it was parent education or either income, and the effects were somewhat similar. So obviously some of them disappeared. And I think we answered that question in the subsequent study where we put three different SES indicators, so 2 household and 1 neighborhood, and we saw that a lot of neighborhood disadvantage effects do persist, but obviously some of them disappear.
Thank you. Katie asks, do you have any thoughts on the antenatal impacts of socioeconomic status?
Yeah, I'm just like, yeah, I'm not that much, unfortunately. So it's something that so antenatal means like right after birth, right? Or is it pre? Antenatal means pre.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so that's postnatal. My brain is just still not working. So antenatal effects of SES. There is only one study that I'm aware of that I'm happy to share afterwards if you email me, that looks at the effects of SES in fetal brain development, not longitudinally. And I think it's just a very challenging thing. And what they find is that there are actually effects even at birth, as well as just in the fetal stages. And obviously, it's quite complicated because genetics is an important confounder that we haven't considered. And that's something that's really important because there are genetic polygenic risk scores that can have an impact on the educational attainment of the parents, but also on the children's own brain structure and function and so on. So that's something that is something that we're actually talking about in a paper that we're writing at the moment.
Oh, that would be really interesting to read.
I mean, I don't know anything about genetics at all, unfortunately. It's a little, it's like a huge caveat to all the research that we do, especially if we're looking, because I think, like I was saying in the postdoc, I really want to start looking at kind of early development. And if in the first few years, there's like, especially at birth, if there are effects, but there are other things, like it's not just genetics. So for example, I think there's less access to care in pregnant mothers who are from low SES backgrounds, and that can lead to different types of nutrition and all these different things that can lead to both fetal and postnatal differences.
Thank you. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to feed into that I think it is an interesting next step whether we can have genetic data on these type of cohort and try to correct for or control for some genetic component through polygenic risk scores. And just to feed in on the antenatal stuff, I guess there's also a suggestion that non-genetic but could be like stress related, like if you're either poor like environment and less support and more stressful for money, etc., the stress might have an impact, the kind of biological impact on physiological impact that could impact the baby.
Yeah, there is one study actually, maybe I can send it to you afterwards, but it's by Nicholas Judd, 2020 in it was published in, I think, PNAS, if I'm not wrong, that looks at a polygenic risk score and SES in the same model. So it's something that you might, whoever's interested might find an interesting read.
Thank you for that reference. In the chat, Siobhan asks, is there an element of the longitudinal study that correlates the child's IQ with socioeconomic status or neighborhood and associated outcomes?
We didn't actually look at that, but it does. We didn't, unfortunately, have a very good IQ measure in the longitudinal study, but we did have school non-completion so this was way before I started my PhD. My PI looked at neighborhood disadvantage, brain development, and school non-completion, and they found that it actually mediated that association, and it was moderated by positive parenting. And I can just reference that here as well. Maybe, yeah, that should be the thing that you're interested in.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Okay, more questions. From John, are you aware of any research that links brain age with academic outcomes?
No, I don't. Actually, we didn't find that it mediated the association. I didn't have time to go into it, but we didn't actually find that brain age mediated any associations with any outcome. So we looked at three things. Yeah, we looked at three things. So internalizing problems, externalizing problems, and then one academic achievement thing, and we didn't find anything. But most people are looking at brain age in the context of mental health and particularly in older adults. So like 40s usually, but nothing yet. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about the brain age metric anymore. But okay. Yeah, if you want to talk about it, we can chat afterwards.
So just to clarify for us, what is kind of the finding in adults about brain age and mental health?
It's quite inconsistent. So I think that, but in general, if you did look at it, it's like older brains are associated with greater mental health problems.
Okay.
So basically but the directionality is not understood because people use cross-sectional data. So it's either that having mental health problem leads to accelerated aging of the brain, or that's a biomarker for people who develop mental health problems, but we don't know that direction yet.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. Another question from Irene. Can you tell us more about what may be the candidate mechanisms linking neighbourhood socioeconomic status and motor and sensory function in particular?
Yeah, this was a bit of a head scratcher, actually. So this is something that we thought about a lot, and we don't completely know, but I think access to green spaces and parks is something that could have an impact on sensory and motor functioning, because having access to parks can have an impact on motor development in children. So that's one thing. But then neighborhood disadvantage also, at least in America, because I think that schools, the amount of funding they receive is dependent on the kind of tax base of the area. So the kind of school that the kid goes to is also in part dependent on this. And I think that could have an impact as well. And then the third thing is, of course, pollution and exposure to toxicants, which tends to be concentrated around poorer neighborhoods, obviously. So I think, yeah, some of the candidate mechanisms, according to me.
And Irene says her area is green space in the chat.
Oh,
So-
we're really interested in that, actually. We should have a chat.
Another question about neighbourhood socioeconomic status effects. Were the results similar across race/ethnic groups?
So, yes. Okay, so we have this in the supplement of the paper, if anyone is interested. But we did control for race and ethnicity to see what happens. It's just really challenging to know whether those effects are true or not, because in a country like the United States, where the data set is from, unfortunately, race and SES are highly, highly confounded. So if you look at the distributions of neighborhood disadvantage for white Caucasian individuals, so if this is low neighborhood disadvantage, it tends to go like this. There's like not that many people at this end. And then it's the exact opposite for Black individuals. So the confounding, so adding something as a confounder to get more precise estimates kind of relies on the fact that there's enough data in all combinations of race and SES, and there's just, unfortunately, not that much. So for example, we only had like 170 Asian Americans in the data set, and that data was quite skewed as well. So I want to say that there were like maybe 30 or 40% of the effects still existed after we controlled for race and ethnic groups, but how reliable those estimates are is hard to comment on.
Right, thank you, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. It's quite a difficult problem, I guess, if you've not got the representation.
We always do it with and without, because that's just the only way to be, completely transparent and try to understand what's going on.
Yeah, something I've been wondering about recently, because in the UK we see the SES effects on academic outcomes, but that they tend to be strongest in like white working class boys. So I've been wondering about like what protective factors there might be within certain cultures, and I wondered if that's something you've considered at all.
Yeah, it's so different, because I was like, cultural context is such a big thing, and the different, like collectivism, for example, certain communities are so much more ready to help each other. And for example, if parents are working, finding a babysitter is really easy, but certain communities are not. And I think it's hard to know. It's just so complex. The environment is just so complex. But I feel like this would be really interesting for whoever's interested in neighborhoods. So Raj Chetty from Harvard has done some pretty cool work on neighborhood. And I think he had 2 papers that came out last year that talked about whether, like, I think it's like moving to opportunity results in improving outcomes. It's and whether children move, but yeah, so it's like there were 2 Nature papers last year. I think they should be pretty easy to find. But if anyone who's interested in neighborhood stuff, and he also looked at race and ethnic groups divided by gender, and you can see that some of these effects were really different especially for Black males. So it looks like the country is, just have a look. It's disturbing, but very interesting research.
Okay, great, thank you for that. Do we have any further questions from the audience? I was actually wondering as well, how is area deprivation measured in your research? Because in my own work, I've been using a different indicator and I wasn't quite sure what it actually involves.
So area deprivation index is kind of like a fact analysis, basically, of 17 different indicators of employment, education, income, real estate values of the neighborhood, and 17 different indicators that account for those things. I think in some countries that they do include things like incarceration rate, pollution, but this one doesn't.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, if we don't have any further questions from the audience, then thank you again for this amazing presentation. And thanks for some really interesting questions from the audience as well. We'll be back on the 12th of January with the seminar series, and I hope you can all join us then.
I just wanted to thank everyone for listening, and thank you so much for this opportunity to present for the CEN seminars. Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.